The chair sat empty. Bob Dylan stared at it. For 50 years, through thousands of concerts, he had never done what he was about to do. November 1994. The Beacon Theater, New York City. 2,000 people waiting in darkness. The stage lit only by a single spotlight that fell on nothing, just an empty wooden chair positioned slightly off-center, angled as if someone had just stood up and walked away. Bob Dylan stood in the wings, guitar in hand, watching that chair. He was 53 years old. He'd been famous for 30 years. He changed music, changed culture, changed the way people thought about what songs could do and what they could mean. He'd been called the voice of a generation so many times the phrase had lost all meaning. But tonight, he was just a man looking at an empty chair and remembering someone who would never sit in it again. The stage manager touched his shoulder. "Mr. Dylan, they're ready for you." Dylan nodded but didn't move. His eyes stayed on that chair. "Do you want us to remove it? I can have someone." "No," Dylan said quietly. "Leave it." He walked onto the stage. The audience erupted. Applause, cheers, the sound of 2,000 people who had paid to see a legend. Dylan barely acknowledged them. He walked to his mark, adjusted his guitar strap, and stood facing the empty chair. The applause died slowly, replaced by confused murmuring. This wasn't how Dylan concerts started. Usually there was music, a band, the familiar opening chords of something everyone knew. But Dylan just stood there, looking at the chair. Silent. 10 seconds passed. 20. 30. The theater fell completely quiet. Dylan's fingers moved to his guitar. He played a single chord. Then stopped. His eyes never left the chair. "I wrote a song once," he said, his voice rough and low, carrying through the theater without a microphone. "Long time ago. 1963. Never recorded it proper. Never played it live. Gave it away to someone else because it wasn't mine to keep." Another chord. Another pause. "The person I gave it to died last week." The audience didn't breathe. That chair, Dylan gestured slightly with his chin, was supposed to be his. He was supposed to be here tonight. We were supposed to play it together. First time in 31 years. Dylan's hand settled on the guitar neck. "So I'm going to play it now. For him. For that empty chair. And if you don't know it, that's all right." He would have known every word. He began to play. Slowly. A melody nobody in that theater had heard before. And Bob Dylan, who rarely explained himself, who built his career on mystery and distance and letting the songs speak, sang a song he'd kept hidden for 3 decades. Bob Dylan performed 50 years and thousands of concerts, but none of them started like this. He stared at an empty chair. After a long silence, he opened his guitar and played that song. To understand what Dylan was playing, you need to understand 1963. And you need to understand a man named James Whitfield. Dylan wasn't yet Bob Dylan in 1963. He was 22 years old, barely known outside Greenwich Village, playing small clubs and coffeehouses for crowds of 50 or 60 people who came for the folk music revival that was sweeping through New York. He was writing constantly. Protest songs. Love songs. Songs that tried to capture what it felt like to be young and angry and awake in America in 1963. Some of those songs would become anthems. Others would disappear, forgotten or given away. James Whitfield was a guitarist. 5 years older than Dylan, black, from Georgia originally, now living in Harlem and playing sessions for anyone who would hire him. He was brilliant. The kind of musician other musicians talked about with reverence. The kind who could make a guitar sound like it was having a conversation. They met at a session in a cramped studio on Bleecker Street. Dylan was recording demos, trying to get anyone's attention. James was hired as a session player, $20 for 3 hours of work. They started talking during a break. About music. About the South. About what it meant to write songs that told the truth versus songs that people wanted to hear. "You write angry," James said, listening to one of Dylan's protest songs. That's good. People need angry. But you know what they need more? What? They need sad. Not the crying kind of sad. The kind of sad that just sits in your chest quiet like and reminds you you're alive. Dylan looked at him. You write? Some. Nothing like you. I mostly just play other people's words. Play me something you wrote. James picked up his guitar and played a melody that Dylan would remember for the next 50 years. Simple. Heartbreaking. The kind of melody that didn't need words because it already said everything. What's it called? Dylan asked when James finished. Don't got a name yet. It's just something I fool around with when I'm alone. That's not a throwaway, Dylan said. That's a song. You need to record that. James smiled sadly. Black folk guitarists don't exactly get record deals in 1963, son. I'm lucky to get session work. They kept talking after the session ended. Went to a bar. Then another one. By 3 a.m, they'd become the kind of friends you make when you're young and both trying to turn music into something that matters. Over the next few months, they saw each other regularly. James would come to Dylan's shows at Gerd's Folk City. Dylan would sit in on James's session work when he could. They'd write together sometimes, Dylan with his words, James with his melodies. One night in May 1963, Dylan showed James a new song he'd written. I was thinking about that melody you played. The sad one. I put words to it. Want to hear? The song was called The Last Light Going. It was about leaving home. About losing people. About how you can be in a room full of people and still feel completely alone. Dylan sang it quietly in James's tiny Harlem apartment, just the two of them and an ashtray full of cigarette butts. When he finished, James sat very still. That's the best thing you've written. It's your melody. But your words. You made it into something. You should record this. We should record it, Dylan corrected. You and me. Your guitar, my voice. That's how it should be. James shook his head. Dylan, you're going places. Columbia's already interested in you. If you record this, you don't want some session player nobody's heard of on it. You're not some. I am. And that's okay. But this song deserves better than me. They argued about it for an hour. Finally, Dylan said, Then you record it. I'll give you the song. You do it yourself. Can't afford studio time. I'll pay for it. We'll figure it out. But they never did. 3 months later, Dylan signed with Columbia Records. His career exploded. By the end of 1963, he was playing to crowds of thousands. By 1964, he was on magazine covers. By 1965, he changed music forever. And James Whitfield was still in Harlem, still playing sessions for $20 a day, still brilliant and still unknown. They lost touch. Not intentionally. Just the way people do when one life accelerates and the other stays still. Dylan sent James a letter once in 1965, apologizing for losing track, promising they'd record that song together someday. James never responded. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. 30 years passed. Bob Dylan became Bob Dylan, the legend, the Nobel Prize winner, the man who'd influenced generations of musicians and writers and anyone who'd ever tried to put truth into art. James Whitfield stayed in New York. He kept playing sessions. He taught guitar to kids in Harlem. He never recorded an album. He never became famous. His name appeared in the liner notes of 100 records as additional guitar or session musician, and nobody ever thought twice about it. Dylan thought about him sometimes. Wondered where he was. Felt guilty in the way you feel guilty about old friends you've lost track of because success pulled you in a different direction. In October 1994, Dylan got a call from an old session producer. You remember James Whitfield? Dylan's stomach dropped. Yeah. Is he? He's dying. Lung cancer. Couple weeks left, maybe. He's at Columbia Presbyterian. He asked if someone could get you a message. Dylan drove to the hospital that night. He hadn't seen James in 31 years. He walked into the room and found a man who looked nothing like the 27-year-old guitarist he remembered. James was 63, hollowed out by sickness, breathing through a tube. But when he saw Dylan, his eyes cleared. "Bobby," James whispered. It was the only name he'd ever called him. Dylan sat in the chair beside the bed. "Hey, James. You got old." "We both did." James smiled weakly. "I followed your career. Every album. Every tour. You did good, man. You did real good. Should have done it together," Dylan said. "That song. We should have recorded it." "Nah. That was your song. I just gave you the melody to put it in. It was ours." They sat in silence for a while. James's breathing was labored. Dylan held his hand. This man he'd known for 6 months 50 years ago, and never quite forgotten. "I'm doing a show next month," Dylan said finally. "Beacon Theater. I was thinking, if you're feeling up to it, maybe you could come. We could play that song. Finally. The way we always said we would." James's eyes filled with tears. "Bobby, I ain't gonna make it to next month. You don't know that. I do. But I appreciate the invitation." Dylan gripped his hand tighter. "Then I'll play it for you. I'll put a chair on stage. Your chair. And I'll play that song we wrote together. First time in 30 years. How's that sound? Sounds like you're gonna make an old man cry." James Whitfield died 3 days later. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. The concert at the Beacon Theater had been scheduled for weeks. Dylan could have cancelled. Could have postponed. Could have done the show and never mentioned James at all. The audience wouldn't have known the difference. But he didn't. He had his stage crew set a chair on stage. Just one. Empty. And he made sure everyone knew it was staying there. When he walked onto that stage on November 18, 1994, and stood looking at that empty chair, he was looking at 50 years of guilt. At a friendship that should have been more. At a song that should have been recorded decades ago. At all the ways success separates you from the people who knew you before you were successful. The song he played, "The Last Light Going," had never been performed publicly. Most Dylan scholars didn't even know it existed. It wasn't on any set list, any bootleg, any archive. But Dylan played it that night. Slowly. Every word clear. His voice rough with age and emotion. His guitar following the melody James had written in 1963 in a Harlem apartment full of cigarette smoke and dreams. The audience didn't know what they were hearing, but they knew it was important. They sat in complete silence. Some cried without knowing why. When Dylan finished, he looked at the empty chair one more time. That was for James Whitfield. Session guitarist. Teacher. Friend. Man who gave me a melody 50 years ago and never asked for credit. If you ever listened to my early records and wondered where some of those guitar parts came from, probably James. He made me better. Made a lot of people better. Most of you never heard his name. That's not right. He paused. But he heard his name. And that's what matters. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Dylan didn't play that song again. Not the next night. Not on any subsequent tour. Not in the 28 years since. It belonged to one night. One empty chair. One debt finally inadequately paid. After the show, Dylan had the chair taken to his home. It sits in his studio now, that empty wooden chair from the Beacon Theater stage. Sometimes, when he's writing, he looks at it and remembers a 27-year-old guitarist who was better than anyone knew, who gave away melodies like they were nothing, who died unknown except to the few people who really listened. Bob Dylan is asked about a lot of songs in interviews. Their meanings. Their origins. He rarely answers directly. But if you ask him about The Last Light Going, About that night at the Beacon Theater, about James Whitfield, he'll tell you. James taught me something I'd forgotten, Dylan said once years later. That being good at music is easy. Being good at music is the least of it. Being good to the people who helped you get there, that's the work. The empty chair sat on stage for 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Then Dylan set his guitar down, walked to the chair, and rested his hand on its back. Thank you for listening, he said quietly. Not to the audience. To the chair. The applause came slowly. Reverent. People standing not because they were excited, but because they understood they'd witnessed something that wasn't entertainment. It was a reckoning. Dylan walked off stage. He didn't return for an encore. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The chair still sits in Dylan's studio. He never played that song again. James Whitfield's name appears in the liner notes of exactly 0 Bob Dylan albums. But on November 18, 1994, for 3 minutes and 42 seconds, a forgotten session guitarist was remembered by 2,000 people. And Bob Dylan, who built his legend on mystery and distance, let everyone see what he carried. Some debts can't be paid. Only acknowledged. And sometimes that's enough.